morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It is truly an honor to be with all of you and with this truly exceptional panel. Just let me say that Maya Seeger is on this panel for the IDB working group, although she belongs to Sustentarse. This is a group of civil society members who actually look at the IDB's work. And our panel today is on the link between transparency and access to information and development. This is a truly important topic, and it reflects the very heart of good governance, whether you are actually government or a multilateral bank like the IDB. But transparency is not just a governance issue, but rather a critical input for development effectiveness. So it's about making a positive, true, measurable difference for people, their families, communities, and for climate and nature. So our panelists today will share with us evidence as well as their experiences of how transparency and information can help deliver on our aspirations in terms of development and climate. And what kind of data and information truly matters? In what stage of the process and for whom? So having said that, I will start with our colleague Paul James from a non-profit, a charity in the UK, which is called Publish What You Fund.
Experience, Paul, can you share examples of how more transparency can lead to greater effectiveness?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Amanda. At Publish What You Fund, we are an advocacy organization which promotes transparency both from aid agencies and multilateral development banks and DFIs. So, of course, we can point to examples of this relationship between transparency and development effectiveness. But first, if you will allow me, I think I'd like to just reframe the question slightly. When we talk about the access to information, we recognize that as a human right. Obviously, in Latin America, it's enshrined in many national laws, in regional agreements such as Escazú. And therefore, our view is it's actually very hard to have any development effectiveness if you don't have transparency as one of the building blocks. So in many ways, I think we see transparency as very much a kind of necessary but not sufficient aspect of achieving development effectiveness. Onto the kind of more tangible links then between the two. One thing that Publish What You Fund have worked on over the last decade is supporting the development and quality of the IATI data standard. So we run 2 programs at the moment, which are indexes measuring transparency, and each incentivize publication of aid data and development finance data to this data standard. I think over recent years, what we have witnessed is the global data set that this standard produces has improved both in quality and scale to the point where civil society and other stakeholders, including institutions themselves, but also shareholders, are able to use this data to effectively hold these institutions to account, to govern these institutions, and for the institutions to manage themselves more efficiently. If I have time, I'll dive into a couple of very
Can you give a couple of examples? And also
course.
Tell people, what does IATI stand for? IATI.
Of course. So IATI is the International Aid Transparency Initiative. So it was set up really to standardize the way that aid data is disclosed. So the IATI standard guides this, and then institutions such as IDB and IDB Invest publish data to this standard. Just in terms of examples from civil society, there was a recent CNN story about aid from the global north flowing to Ghana, and it was in support of, or it was flowing to organizations who were supporting a anti-LGBTQI law which was to be passed. Obviously, this makes the aid sound perhaps not particularly development effective, but I think in that kind of broader conception of how civil society feeds into the development effectiveness of these programs, it really allowed these journalists to identify the parties who were kind of promoting these regressive views, and the data set was really fundamental to this work.
Yeah. There's so many ways to use the IATI data, so I do suggest maybe we can post a link afterwards. Let's go now to Maya. Desde la perspectiva del BID working group, the IDB
From the perspective of the IDB working group, how can multilateral banks such as the IDB enhance transparency, and why is it important to think about transparency in tandem with access to information, participation, and stakeholder engagement and accountability? Thank you very much. First, greetings to all of you on behalf of the IDB Working Group, which is a working group of civil society organizations, both international, regional, and national in scope. We currently have here with us representatives from a whole lot of countries. There's over 30 organizations. Hi there. I've been entrusted with the responsibility of speaking on behalf of the group. Thank you for the trust in me. And I would like to explain some of what we do. We are an independent organization. We don't receive funds from the IDB. And our role, as the president said, is to inform and discipline, as he said. And often, our role is not truly comprehended by all stakeholders. Sometimes it is up to us to say what things are not working properly. So I would first like to provide that context so that you understand what we're about. We believe that transparency is crucial. As a human right, Paul mentioned this, and it is a key right as it enables access to other rights, such as the right to participation, to consultation, and to accountability. So unless we are able to get the required information duly on time, and if that information is not truly usable and expressed in culturally appropriate ways and language, as civil society, our right to exercise the other rights is curtailed. And especially in the context of our work, which focuses on human rights and on good social and environmental governance, there's the important right of communities to have a say in decisions that affect them in their own territories, typically projects that may carry impact and risk, but also when it comes to policy making, because they often lead to certain projects or change the scope and framework of intervention. So our working group has been collaborating critically with the bank, providing perspectives and feedback from the point of view of communities and civil society in terms of policy changes and safeguards for the bank, also with a focus on projects that we have found could prove risky or have adverse impact for different sets of stakeholders, especially marginalized groups. So, Amanda, in responding to the question, that is basically the reason for the importance of transparency and access to information for this large segment of the population that might be affected by the bank's decisions. Yes, information here is key, and we will now talk to Roberto Saba. Not only is he a professor of constitutional law and human rights, but also he's a member of some independent committees providing advice as part of our information process. From your point of view, why is this important, and how does the demand for greater transparency originate, and what stakeholders are involved? How can we actually market our access to information for the benefit of people? Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. In addition to being a professor and being on the external access to information panels of the IDB, I have been a human rights activist and have worked on access to information, so I have a historical perspective on the importance of the right to information and transparency for over 20 years already. And these social demands and these civil society demands are very recent. 30 years is quite novel. And this started due to environmental problems, corruption issues in the region, and they have pressurized governments, especially at the beginning, into having access to information mechanisms as part of a policy on transparency that is critical for development. With no access to information, there can be no transparency. If there's no transparency, there can be corruption. If there's corruption, there's no development. So as the first stage of social demands for access to information, we have looked at governments and demanded that they regulate access to information through laws on information access in the countries in a region. This is pretty novel. Some countries, like Argentina, until 2017, had no access to information law.
So that demand on governments has also created greater mindfulness about the need for transparency. And all of this has spread. Right now, there are demands for transparency on the part of the private sector. For example, also international financial institutions are being pressured. And all of these entities are thinking of and designing different ways to respond to those requirements. Governments have access to information laws in place, and the private sector and international financial institutions also have reacted and implemented transparency policies. So basically, that is where things stand. Thank you. And how do you think, or what would be some good examples of what you were saying about laws or the private sector? Well, here there's something that's very important, and it's been said. It was said by the president and then later also. But access to information is a tool to assure respect for rights. It's a way to hold governments and other institutions responsible. It is an instrument for participation. Here it was said that the bank requires greater participation, greater engagement, because without access to information, we cannot control the way in which governments and the private sector interact in the marketplace. So we need to have information that is related to that so that the market and private activities will operate properly. Unfortunately, we have seen some cases in the region where there has been corruption, and that has touched upon the state and the private sector, or sometimes also this has led to a greater call, a stronger call for transparency and access. Now I call on Andrea Repetto, who is director of the IDB's Independent Consultation and Investigation Mechanism, ICIM. So please tell us a bit about the MISI mechanism, how it assures compliance with the bank's operational policies, and for you, exactly what is the role for transparency in promoting development? Thank you, Amanda, and good morning. It is a pleasure to be here with you today and to see such a full room. It's important to be having this conversation about the role of transparency and inclusion in development. So let me refer to MISI. Development is hard to achieve. The region has many current and future needs to address. And for the IDB group to be able to play that role and to help the countries of the region achieve development and accomplish its mission of improving lives, the bank holds itself to a high standard so as to do this in a way that's sustainable. In this very complex effort, not everything will always turn out well. So it's important for the IDB group, as part of this effort for transparency, honesty, be able to find a way to address and handle situations that did not turn out as foreseen, working with the public, the private sector, and also with civil society organizations. So in order to be able to respond to those scenarios where there may have been negative environmental or social impacts, the way that the IDB group responds is very important. And one way, one type of response, is by making available to citizens an independent accountability mechanism, and that is MISI, the ICIM, so as to be able to heed those voices and thus help communities, the public and private sector, NGOs, the IDB group, to find solutions, to find a response to the problem situations that have arisen, so as to be able to hold the bank to these high standards. So now, for those not acquainted with MISI, MISI is the independent consultation investigation mechanism, and it spans the whole IDB group. ICIM is an accountability office, and we look at transparency as well as environmental and social complaints, looking at any social impact of a project financed by the IDB, and that could be in either the public or the private sector. ICIM was born at an annual meeting like this one, and that was in 2010 in Cancun, Mexico. The governors decided that the 9th capital increase of the IDB would depend upon the creation of our office, and the office was created to make certain that the IDB projects would be sustainable, and that means that they truly do contribute to the development in the region. And if there are communities that feel that they have been affected by a project, it could be a road, an airport, a power line, for example, there would be a way to channel concerns or complaints. And the ICIM is an independent group. We report directly to the Board of Executive Directors of the IDB, and their member countries are represented. That independence is very important for our office because it allows us to work impartially, objectively with all of the parties involved.
Okay. Bueno. Muchas gracias por esa explicación.
Thank you very much for that description of the ICIM. And I will come back to you so that we can talk about what we are learning about. Now, let me go back to Paul.
If you were one of the organizations here today, what would you be analyzing about the IDB or IDB Invest? And I know that you have really specialized in looking at development finance institutions like IDB Invest. Please.
Thank you. So one of the projects we undertake, we call the DFI Transparency Index. So it measures the transparency of 30 public sector and private sector MDB and bilateral DFI portfolios across the globe. IDB and IDB Invest are both featured in it. So within our non-sovereign or private sector, IDB Invest actually rank as the 5th most transparent of the institutions, scoring approximately 42 out of 100. So they're not positioned so badly, but there is clearly work to do.
We could do better.
You could do better. IDB on the sovereign side currently ranks 3rd out of the institutions that we measure. I think something that is hopefully particularly relevant to this audience and ties into some of the comments around MISI is, in the case of IDB, they're one of the few institutions who have a policy that actually directs that the client or the borrower must inform project-affected communities about the presence of the independent accountability mechanism. This is something we look for in policy and we reward through the index. What is missing, though, with respect to IDP, and we think this is particularly important, is to go a step beyond having that policy and providing some form of assurance that the policy is actually followed. We typically don't see this. So we look for evidence that IDB have actually ensured that whoever has borrowed capital, whoever is implementing a project, has actually done the policy required outreach to project-affected communities. We look at a lot of stakeholder engagement plans, a lot of pre-project impact appraisals, and while we find this on occasion, it's something which is lacking. So this is something which we would really like to see be developed further and to really kind of drive that assurance of community disclosure, not just with the MISI, also across the actual project disclosure, environmental and social disclosure, but it applies also to the MISI. I think in terms of our product and how it can be used, it is essentially a comparative analysis. Across the product, we compare over 100 different types of data that are disclosed across these institutions. So I'd really encourage people to kind of look at the results and kind of identify best practice, hold the institutions to account of this best practice, and also, I guess, kind of celebrate where that best practice is at times.
Yeah, okay, great. So we'll look forward to your reporting on this in the future, and of course, some of the organizations here today may also be interested in doing more. Let's go back to you, Maya. ¿Dónde ves que están los desafíos o
Where do you think the
oportunidades más
challenges
grandes
and
hacia el
opportunities lie with a view to the future?
Bien, en primer
Well,
lugar,
first of all,
quisiera destacar que el BID
I would
tiene
like
políticas
to
de acceso a
stress
la
that the
información,
IDB
también,
has
¿cierto?
access to
Un
information
marco,
policies. And
actuación ambiental y social,
also
un marco
we
de
have an
política,
environmental and social
está
action
bastante
framework,
desarrollado.
and that
Sin
framework
embargo,
is
vemos
well
debilidades en
developed.
su implementación.
However, we
Tanto
have
en
to
términos de
assure
capacidad,
continuity in implementation
del propio
in
BID, pero
terms of the
fundamentalmente
capabilities
también en la
in-house of the
implementación por
IDB,
parte
but
de los
also looking
clientes.
at implementation on the part of our
En este
clients.
caso pueden ser
In
tanto
this
los
case,
gobiernos
it could
como
be
también el
governments,
sector
it
privado.
could also be
En
the
el caso, por
private
ejemplo,
sector.
de BID
In the
Invest con las
case of
empresas,
IDB Invest,
se
they
remite
work
mucho
with
información que provee
corporations,
la propia
and
empresa.
there a lot of
Entonces,
the
la difusión de la
information
información parece
provided
más
to us
una acción
by
de
the
relaciones
corporation
públicas,
is
porque la
shared,
empresa
it's sent forward.
siempre dice que está
So
todo
the
perfecto.
company always says that things are
Y eso,
perfect,
con
and
frecuencia no es así.
that
Muchas
often
veces
may
hay
not be the
información que no
case.
se publica.
Often there
En el
is
caso, por
information
ejemplo,
that
de
is
la
not
región
posted. For example, in
de litio
Argentina,
sal de vida,
there
donde
was
hay
a project
estudio
called
sobre
Lithium,
impacto
Salt of Life, and
acumulativo
there
que no
is
se
a
ha dado
a study that was not shared with the communities. Also, sometimes there are problems with access to information if the information is requested, or that access is not provided in a timely fashion. Now, operationally, often we do have problems, so I think that here we have room for improvement. Also, we feel that in the access to information policy that is currently being developed, and right now it's out for consultation, we think that alignment with the agreement is important. The agreement that in Latin America is the guideline for access to information, and it's mentioned only as a footnote without giving it the importance it deserves. We have 24 signatory countries in the region. Also, we think that in terms of transparency, it would be a lot, or we should have greater involvement of civil society at the level of decision-making. The president this morning was talking about looking for solutions at the regional level. Now, we don't know who makes those decisions, who sets priorities, who is involved. And it would be important for civil society to be able to also take part in what is called upstreaming. In other words, making these major strategic decisions on regional policy. Now, I could go on and on addressing some practical concerns. Those are things that we're looking at because we have done a lot of technical work. But basically what I am doing is pointing to some of our findings. there are opportunities that we see with high expectations following the announcement made by the President this morning, where he talked about a framework for our engagement with civil society. So this is a good time to strengthen our ties and to get feedback from those of us who are on the ground. And we're the ones that feel the sometimes undesired impact of decisions made without involvement of people that are actually affected by those decisions. So I also want to thank the IDB Working Group and all members. Thank you very much for commenting on the institutional strategy, for example, also for our access to information policy. All of this is tremendously helpful. And now, going to back to what was said about the private sector, could you extend the same demand for transparency? Could you apply that to the private sector? And again, could you give us some examples? What have you seen in the public and private sectors? Well, I would begin with the second part of your question. When we got started with these transparency practices, the access to information, etc., with governments, we have seen things happening in the private sector. In recent years, we have seen a lot of activities that used to be handled by the state are now in the hands of the private sector. That could be public utilities or defense, say law enforcement, jails. So the question is, well, what we used to think was in the hands of government is now being dealt with by the private sector. And so, for example, we see entities providing public services. Also, we see management of private sources. Sometimes in some countries, that is seen as something that enjoys an exception. So databases are often in private hands, and people want to know what those databases say about them. Also, another thing, as Maya was saying, the international financial institutions, IFIs like the IDB, also have had to respond to a call for greater transparency, and they have responded with access to information policies. That's relatively new, and those policies mean that information can be requested from the IDB, from the IDB Invest, and in case that request is denied, there is an appeal mechanism in place. And then ultimately there is an external panel that would deal with that request. And we decide based on those cases where access to information has been denied. So all of this, here the important thing is just what we see with the access to information policies or laws. They are a point of departure so as to begin to deal with that call for information. So there are different instruments to access the information. But civil society, there are a lot of people here that work with civil society, and they need to be able to use these tools so that they can implement the policy. Policies never implement themselves. That's true. They have to be used to see what works and what doesn't. So thank you very much for the services that you are providing to all of us by serving on this external panel. Now, Andrea, looking to the future, what are the future challenges for MISI, for the bank policies? What are the main considerations regarding access to information and transparency in the future? Well, thank you, Amanda. First of all, before talking about challenges, I would like to pick up on what Maya was saying about implementation. In other words, having high standards. Often that is not enough. Implementation often faces major challenges. But the truth is, it's essential to be able to hear from the communities so that they can receive information about the projects. And that information has to be clear, timely, and there has to be transparency. And if there is an impact, the mechanisms have to be in place. They have to have the information. So this is precisely inclusion and accountability. So if there is no transparency, if there's no inclusion, if there's no accountability, it is truly hard for there to be development. And now I would like to talk about the challenges. They are related. In the MISI, we have many global challenges that also affect the region. But in the MISI, I would say that access is one of the main issues. That's something that Roberto said. If these tools are there, people need to know they exist, that they're available, and that they can be used. And that is important. People, communities need to know that these mechanisms do exist so that they can use them, and they can, when things do not work well, what they can do, what we can do to make certain that policies will be complied with if they haven't been in the past. Another important thing regarding access is how can we be efficient in our responses? How can we truly work with different groups, different players, so that they can work, or we can work jointly with them to find a solution to the complaint they bring? Also, how can the IDB group, working with the public and private sectors, how can we begin to understand the importance of these mechanisms? The environmental, the social problems addressed by organizations like MISI, or if things don't work out as foreseen, when there's an undesired impact, how can we work with the mediation agencies or groups to find an answer? That is very important. Then we have more global challenges, but this ties in with opportunities too. I think the new institutional strategy of the IDB group will be an opportunity because it clearly lays out what we're doing in sustainability, transparency, inclusion, accountability, and these are essential elements for development. From my perspective, I think that in order to be truly transparent, we have to be able to monitor our projects, for example, in the Amazon. All of this is key for the region, but definitely the importance of this side-by-side work where everyone in the IDB group, where civil society, where the public and private sectors are all working together. All of that is going to be very important. MISI is right at the heart of all of these safeguards, all of these mechanisms to ensure that projects will unfold properly.
Donde la verdad estamos viendo la efectividad en la práctica.
And we are seeing how effective you are in practice. So I think that this brings us to the end of the time allotted for this discussion. I don't know if any panelist has a final comment. Yes, please go ahead. Yes, I wanted to share with you some information from a study done by one of our members. It's the Accountability Council. Between 2010 and 2023, they analyzed more than 230 complaints submitted to MISI. And they were able to find that 31% of those complaints originated because of a lack of transparency, a lack of participation. So by improving those two aspects, we could also avoid a lot of conflicts. Right, that goes right to the heart of the matter. So, message received. I wanted to thank all of our panelists for their participation, for their insights, and we are very excited with our ability to work together. So I'm going to call on Flavia Milano, who is our lead specialist. I would ask Flavia to come back on stage. Thank you for that applause. This has been a very exciting morning. We have a full room here today. And thank you, Amanda, for giving me this opportunity. And also, I thank the panelists because they're the true experts in transparency. When we talk about abstract issues, And with transparency, accountability, those are abstract concepts, but how do we apply them? First of all, we heard from Nadino from the Amazon. We heard about informal labor opportunities. And something that we see in IDB and IDB Invest is that with the tools that we have, we really cannot be effective in including stakeholders. This morning, the president said it several times. It was emphasized also by the vice president. We need to have the three players in development together: governments, private sector, public sector. The three have an important role to play to assure the development of Latin America and the Caribbean. So in what I was saying, where we realized that we really didn't have the tools that we needed, we decided to go to the region. And we asked hundreds of CSOs. We met with all of the UN agencies you can think of. We met with other multilaterals. And we always ask the same question: what happens if we do work together well? If something worked out well, what happened? If something didn't work out well, what happened? And what we found is that you as CSOs, as foundations, as think tanks, as chambers, you're always finding that 5 things happen. Out of the 5, 3 are certain. And what we found was information. You just talked about information, transparency, access to information, but it's not only access to information. This is a two-way street because there's the information I gather and the information I provide. And when I say gather, we have this new dimension of civil society. That is citizens. These are people that have joined together and they are influencing reality. And that changes things. Over the last 5 years, the whole concept of civil society has changed. We have information, we have dialogue, like we have here today. It's what we are promoting, and the president said this. This is a historic moment. It is a moment of change. We want to do things better. So these dialogues, these meetings, and we're going to the countries with this too. We have also met with indigenous communities for public consultation. Some of you have participated in public consultations. Others may have heard mention of that type of consultation, but we have worked hard to try to constantly improve. And then there are 2 levels that we saw, things that sometimes happen, sometimes don't, but hopefully they will. One thing is collaborating, working together. When we talk about ancestral knowledge, that may appear on the ground, but NGOs, CSOs can say, let's do this in a better way. Sit down, hear how we would like to do it. So we want to work with you to strengthen you as part of institutional capacity. And the last thing that we saw is partnerships. Nadino talked about this. So we, as partners, often leverage resources on the ground. Now, I have had the future of meeting with hundreds of you, and today we're meeting as a family. But in meeting you, we have seen that we can leverage resources working with local corporations or companies, or others say, let's apply this public policy. So it's an invitation to think differently. That is what the president was saying this morning, where we are taking action to implement what he called for. And we see that often there can be shortcomings. And they say to me, Flavia, how can there be failings? Because all of us here are over the age of 12, and we've all experienced failure, and that makes us stronger. It gives us experience, and institutions are no exception. They go through the same cycle. So today we showed you a failure that I would like to share with you. It's a case that we compiled to present it today.
En una operación de infraestructura de transporte en el norte de Itaupey, región indígena de Praname, se inició un relevamiento de las 431 poblaciones indígenas de la zona, con el objetivo de conectarlas con otros mercados en el centro del país, así como con escuelas secundarias y centros deportivos. El proyecto llevaba varios meses de atraso. Para evitar nuevas dilaciones, el jefe de proyecto decidió finalizar el diseño del mismo en la sede de la capital y llegar a la región con el trabajo hecho. Respetando las políticas operativas de su institución que obligan a informar sobre los proyectos, subió a la página web institucional y a la del gobierno local los objetivos y resultados esperados. Los estudios de factibilidad socioeconómica mostraban lo bien estructurada que estaba la iniciativa y atrajeron el interés de capitales adicionales extranjeros al área de proyecto, rica en recursos naturales. El jefe de la iniciativa, analizando las oportunidades sociales y económicas que traerían las nuevas inversiones a las comunidades, ajustó algunas de las actividades y comenzó el trabajo con hombres y mujeres locales. Dado que para captar data local se había mapeado a los actores según información desactualizada y no todos los beneficiarios directos de la iniciativa fueron informados sobre la misma, se generó una desconfianza hacia las verdaderas intenciones del proyecto, especialmente por la presencia de nuevas actividades en una zona que sus pobladores mantienen fuera del alcance extranjero. Tras detener la iniciativa, se iniciaron diálogos con la población para captar información de manera directa. Sin embargo, las comunidades detuvieron el proyecto definitivamente, alegando que no habían sido considerados en primera instancia y temían que esto pudiera repetirse a futuro.
So what did we see here? We saw people that were doing their work well, very committed, saying we're going to do this consultation, this dialogue, but we're behind schedule. This is a super project. People are not going to be against it, so let's move ahead. This is a case that we have summarized here. And the important thing here is that this is a factor that we often overlooked, and it is something that people say, and it is perception is reality. I wish that I would have come up with that, but it's something that people often say. What people perceive is their reality. And here, where they tried to correct what they didn't do early on, but not intentionally, they were trying to do things better, more quickly. And so what people were perceiving was, we want a school. And we were saying, okay, we're going to provide them with another type of activity. And the people in the community were saying, no, that's not what we want. And so that holds us back in terms of our projects. So there's another case, and here the bank has shown you this case. You can see it on the bank's web page. Otherwise, you can stop me in the halls and ask me. But we also have success stories. So if there are no questions, if there are no comments, and here, first of all, I want to thank the panelists for being with us today, and I will stop here. Thank you.